Time to move.
Good evening and welcome. I'm Maria Perbellini, the Dean of the School of Architecture and Design at New York Tech. And it is my great pleasure to welcome you to the presentation of the book, The Aluminaire House, by Francis Campani, Associate Professor, and Michael Schwarting, Professor Emeritus at the School of Architecture and Design. The Aluminaire House was designed by the architects A. Lawrence Kosher and Albert Frey as an affordable, easy to reproduce unit for mass production and built in New York City for an exhibition of modern materials at the Architectural League and Allied Arts Exposition in 1931. Today, the structure is known as the first all-metal prefabricated house built in the United States. The book traces the house 93 years history, amazing, and Professors Campani and Schwarting's 36-year involvement with it, including rescuing the house from demolition multiple times. And we are going to hear the story about that. After New York Tech acquired the Aluminaire House in 1988, with the help of a grant from New York State, students in Professor Michael Schwarting's design workshop reconstructed the house as it was a class assignment in New York Tech Central Islip campus. Then the school moved into Old Westbury campus much later, and we probably hear the story later, right? Again. So our professors, and I'm so happy to see both of them together tonight, Schwarting and Campani have formed the Aluminaire House Foundation with stewardship of the modernist icon and saving the critical meaning of that artifacts. In 2020, the Aluminaire House Foundation donated the house to the Palm Springs Museum of Art in California to be part of this permanent collection. And the house was moved 3 times before finding the permanent home in Palm Springs recently. The final reconstruction was recently completed and celebrated during the Modernist Week in March 2024. It was an 11-day celebration of mid-century modern design, architecture, art, fashion, and culture in Greater Palm Springs. But I stop here because I want to hear the full story from Francis and Michael, and please help me to welcome them to the podium. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you, Dean Caroline. Thank you all.
Absolutely.
Thank you all for coming. Oh, and I just want to say, we're going to sort of do this as a tag team, but Michael's going to begin.
Okay.
I'll leave for now.
Good evening, everybody, and thank you all for coming. The Dean alluded to this saga that we've been through, and we'll try to give you the short story of this so that we can get through it. I'd like to start sort of repeating some of what the Dean has already announced, that in 1930, the Allied Arts and Industries biannual exhibition with the Architectural League of New York, which still exists, asked A. Lawrence Coker to come up with an idea for the building products display. The Allied Arts and Industries had biannual shows of building products. The Architectural League had their own exhibition of members' work. Coker had been the manager and managing editor of Architectural Record since 1928. And the previous League exhibition, Coker had made a full-scale model of an architectural office, which was quite successful. So in relation to this, Coker hired Albert Frey, a 28-year-old Swiss architect who had just arrived in the United States, having worked in Le Corbusier's office in Paris. And the two proposed a model dwelling utilizing and thus displaying new standard off-the-shelf materials. So I'm going to sort of take you through a kind of understanding of what the house is like. It's much easier to visit it than it is to do this, but in any case, this is the catalog of the Architectural League exhibition. This was a pamphlet for the Aluminaire house in the Allied Arts, and you can see in the title below, it's not part of the league, although they shared the same space. And in April 18th, the Aluminaire house was opened in 1931. This is also part of the little catalog for the Aluminaire house, and it's the companies and manufacturers that supplied materials. You can't really read this, but in fact, a number of them, particularly Alcoa Aluminum, is on this list and still exists today, interestingly. The garage doors, for instance, are the same. So this is quite an elaborate list of donated materials that the either manufacturer or the supplier actually put into place for this exhibition. There are very few photographs of the original house in the Grand Central Palace. I mean, you can imagine this is inside a building, which I'll talk about in a moment, what the Grand Central Palace was. So probably it was pretty difficult to photograph, but this is the entrance into the exhibition. And one of the things that you can see from this image is that it looks unfinished, but in fact, it was intentionally kind of open in parts so one could see the means of construction and also see the materials, which all the suppliers wanted everyone to see. This is another photograph. The Grand Central Palace had a mezzanine, and this must have been an upper shot of them putting the panels onto the house. And the only other photograph is a sort of strange one. This is the dining room table in the Aluminaire house, which was a rollout table, supposed to roll out, didn't really work well. But several secretaries from the exhibition with Albert Frey sitting and obviously posing for this photograph. So the other interesting element to this is that this was a model that Albert Frey made very early on of the design, and it was used to take around to the suppliers and manufacturers for their donations so that they could see what was happening. And that this apparently was a pretty important useful tool for doing that. However, it's been lost. And the other part of understanding what the house was like in 1931 are drawings by Albert Frey, a substantial number. There's an archive in Williamsburg, Virginia, of a Coker archive, and it has a good supply of the information that we're presenting tonight. So this is one of the key views. Obviously, Albert was fond of seeing the front and the side at the same time. And this happens kind of over and over again. And the two facades have an interesting kind of discussion with one another, which we'll talk about a little bit. So these are Albert's plans. You can see he used Le Corbusier's kind of title block. These even the stencils that Le Corbusier used, and you can still buy in Paris. I'll sort of take you through the plan to give you an understanding of the house. The lower left is the ground floor plan, and you would enter from the left side of the porch into the hall and go up the stairs to the bulk of the house. Another important part was the garage, The garage had two garage doors. You could drive in one end and drive out the other. And think about Villa Savoie, where the car does that. And as you would go up the stairs, you would see the boiler in a very kind of ceremonial niche. And Albert told us that he thought that was the coming sculpture, modern sculpture, and should be on display. So you would get a view of the boiler going up the stairs. You would also get a view, which is hard, maybe the photographs at the end of this lecture will give you an idea of that spatial situation. But you could see all the way up through the second floor and up to the ceiling of the double height living room. So the next plan to the right of the ground floor plan, you would arrive at the stairs where the arrow comes up, and there's the dining room with the fold-out table. It's set for 4 in this plan, and the living room, which is, as I said, a double height space. Off the dining room was a kitchen, mostly stainless steel, to look more like restaurant kitchens than residential or dwelling kitchens. And then you would go around to the bedroom. There were 2 suspended beds to clean under them or whatever, and a curved curtain for an exercise space and closure to the bathroom. There's also a closure, a little metal gridded cabinet for the toilet, and in this drawing a bidet, which would never have fit, but in any case. So you've come up the stair, you wind around and you go up the stair again to the 3rd level, which is labeled the library, but also a guest bedroom with a tiny little bathroom, which sort of overhangs the dining room in a kind of precarious but very sculptural way, which you'll see in the views. Also on that upper level is an outdoor terrace with an area, the stippled area that Albert in some drawings labeled lawn, and another fold down table so that you could sit at the terrace. You can also see this dumbwaiter, which appears on each floor. It goes at the entrance, it goes to the kitchen, and it goes to the terrace, so you could send your martinis up from the kitchen to the upper terrace. And you can see the kind of cutouts of the roof area open to that lawn. Albert's drawing again of the elevations and a section, the 4th elevation is missing, which you'll sort of see why at a certain point. But the front facade is B, and the kind of signature side facade is C. A is, this is the kitchen and the dining room, the garage probably coming out, the upper terrace, and a section that goes through the double height living room and through the terrace, upper terrace, and the lower entrance terrace. So Albert, in his design process, made lots of perspective sketches. And that's was wonderful for us to be able to see his intentions and also get a good idea of the project that we were about to take on that we'll talk about. So this is a view of the entrance foyer. You can see the little blue is the dumbwaiter, which opened on both sides, outside and inside, and the front door next to it, and the staircase, a little bit of it on the bottom, and the boiler, which is red hot up in the niche. When you arrived at the 2nd level, you had the fold-out table, the 4 chairs. The table was attached to and rolled up. It was a rubber top that was supposed to roll up into a glass case, which you can see held with 2 chrome columns that had plumbing for the upper bathroom. Excuse me. Albert's sketches are wonderful. He's always aware of shadows. And we learned before we actually met him that he was left-handed because the shadows are always going in that direction. Two sketches of the kitchen. The dumbwaiter is at the end, and slight variations of those. And this, which is perhaps the most important drawing for us, is a sketch that Albert made of the living room, the double height living room. The structural frame is all exposed that we'll talk about. The glass cabinet hasn't been quite decided on yet, but what's interesting in this, and it's a crayon on cardboard, was that the walls are all different colors with no real rhyme or reason to the color scheme. And this was important for us, and we discussed it, as was mentioned, with Albert himself. The bedroom with the curtain to the exercise space. The little rectangle is the dumbwaiter coming to the bedroom as well as the kitchen. And the bathroom, where two sketches, one where the toilet cabinet is solid, and the second one where it becomes a frame with transparent panels in it. Oops, sorry. And finally, coming up the stairs again into the library, the door is to that little pretty cramped bathroom, and views over into the double height living room, down into the bottom of the living room. There were skylights in the bathroom, and you can see a bit of one in the library. And then the outdoor porch, terrace up above, with the dumbwaiter, now white. It had a circular glass in it that he sketched very quickly all over and over again. And the fold down table. And two more sketches of that. And we'll talk about that because this diagonal wall kind of seems to loom in all the images of the project. So a little bit about the construction. Aluminaire, you could guess there's a lot of aluminum. The house is supported on 6 5-inch diameter columns, which you can see a sketch on the left that Albert did and a sketch on the right that Francis did of the way it was actually built. This at the intersection wouldn't really work. But in any case, it's a frame with a cantilever, a one-way cantilever, the same that Le Corbusier deployed in many of his early house projects. This is all aluminum, to have been aluminum. Some of it was steel, but they maybe ran out in the construction of the exhibition. Off of this frame was a girt system, a 2x2 angle. You can see steel angle. It was attached to the frame so that the facade was suspended in its attachment to the frame. It was the girt, or this steel angle, ran continuously and a rhythm that set up the relationship to the panel, which we'll see more clearly. The wood nailer that we've called it, the 2x2, is the attachment of the facade to the girt system. And on the outside, that's 2 inches, and there's a 1/2 inch of insulation. You have to remember that insulation is just beginning to be a product in 1931. So it's kind of the departure from the cavity wall issues of construction that preceded this. But then there's a exterior covered corrugated aluminum covering, and an aluminum screw and an aluminum washer. That fastens the whole exterior facade to the wood nailer, which is fastened to the girt, which is fastened to the frame. And on the inside, there's the same insulation panel and a wall covering called Fabricoid. This was a new product by DuPont that came in various forms. They made luggage, car seats, and one section of it was wall coverings, which were pastels, a kind of rayon. This is also the beginning of synthetic fabrics. So this is the whole assembly, the fabricoid. And if you remember that sketch of colors that starts to tie into materials and choices that Albert made. I won't go into this too much except to say we always love making diagrams. So we've tried to diagram sort of key issues from its cubicness to its kind of spatial and structural or construction matrices. So the six columns, the fact that the house is sort of divided into two, front and back. And what becomes interesting, and I'll only suggest this and hopefully it reveals itself, but in that circulation that winds itself up through the center of the building, the building rotates. So what is front and entrance, which is this facade, becomes another front on the side that the double height living room faces, and the dining room and living room go in a different direction than the orientation of entry on the front. Hope that's sort of clear, but I could spend all day talking about that diagram. So back to the exhibition. Again, a page from the little brochure. Maybe one thing I left out, which I should say, the house is 23 feet wide on the front and back, 28 feet on the sides, and 27 feet in height, in the 3-story height. So it's almost cubic, but not, and probably intentional, but in Albert's mind. So this is, as I say, the catalog. The exhibition was put together in 10 days. So all the pieces had to come together from these manufacturers. It all was put together in the Grand Central Palace, and it was open for 7 days and taken down. 1931. This the page in the catalog that showed the model and the Albert's drawings of the plans, and there you can see the lawn. So 100,000 people came. The New York Times reported 130,000. And it was in the press, the popular press, a little bit more than the architectural press. But here's Albert again, and probably the same secretaries. He's showing them how easy it is to put up a panel in a newspaper article, and that's the announcement of the exhibition over on the right. So there were lots of articles published very quickly because it was only open for 7 days. One that came out after the fact, a year or two later, is an interesting popular mechanics diagram, which is pretty accurate and shows a lot of the things I've just tried to take you through. So in our investigations, and we'll talk a bit about how we worked on this with students, we constantly studied the relationship of the Aluminaire house to housing. It was part of the curriculum we established with the project, but it's also important, the kind of relationships that the house has to things that were happening in Europe and in America. Exhibition. This was an exhibition house. One of the important exhibitions in 1927 is the Mies Wiesenhof Siedlung in Stuttgart, with Mies's project on the right and Le Corbusier's project, which has a lot of interesting relationships to the Aluminaire house, double height living room, curved lower floor pieces. But not only to modern architecture and these experiments and exhibitions of housing, but also to built housing that would have been an important influence that Albert would have been able to bring to the project. He had visited the Korb house in Stuttgart, for instance. So there's Siemensstadt on the upper left and Rammerstadt on the upper right, Kiefhoek in Holland and Amsterdam South, all experiments in not just residential prototype, but about making cities. And that was an interesting, important issue that has been important to our work, which Francis is going to talk about. The work of Le Corbusier is obviously important, the Maison Domino, the Type 4, which is kind of carved into a cubic volume. An article that I wrote while we were working on the project for the Long Island AIA, comparing it to the Le Corbusier's Esprit Nouveau Pavilion. There's so many likenesses of that it was pretty easy to write about. But another exhibition house, double height living room, space, and so forth that are clearly relationships to Albert Frey's thinking. Also important is the funny shapes on the plan are a diorama with Le Corbusier's City of Tomorrow in it. So the house and the city are part of a important interrelationship. I already showed that, but sort of repeat the kind of influence, I think, of Stuttgart on the project. And one project that Albert worked on, and Albert worked on the Villa Savoie and several projects, big projects, the Centre Soyuz building in Moscow and so forth. But one that he worked on is this Maison Le Chour, which was after World War I proposed housing with zinc metal panels and a wall dividing 2 units. So it's a 2-family house that had a day plan and a night plan. It kind of unfolded in different ways, which are presented in this Le Corbusier drawing. But Albert worked on this, and the idea of putting 2 together is something we'll come to also. So this started a whole bunch of interesting discussions about mass production and housing that Francis is going to talk about.
Yes, so in April of 1931, Coker and Frey published this article, Real Estate Subdivisions for Low-Cost Housing. This appeared while the house was on display in the Grand Central Palace. And it challenged the traditional, I'll move forward, the traditional block configuration. So they suggested alternate ways to make blocks, making a porous block so that the gardens could filter through the block, and also making one with a pervious perimeter so you'd have gardens in the middle and street on the edge. And the unit they used to suggest these conditions was a simplified version of the Aluminaire house. I think this is just an enlargement from the previous page, but they make these configurations using this unit. And as Michael said about the last facade that's not shown in their drawings, it's a blank facade, and it suggests that this unit should be combined. I think it's interesting that if they had actually had the diorama attached to the house in the Grand Central Palace, they might not have needed to publish this article, but this is the way they displayed their intentions of the house as a repeatable unit. And there are probably many reasons for the interest in community making. I mean, the European examples that Michael showed are certainly some of those reasons. Another one, I think, is an article that was published in 2 parts in January and February of 1930 in Architectural Record by Louis Mumford, and it was called Mass Production in the Modern House. And Mumford is very cautious, I'd say even skeptical about mass production as a solution to housing. He's cautionary, and he argues that the mass production is already a change that's been taking place in building for the last 150 years, and he doesn't see it as an answer to contemporary housing. He notes that houses, in fact, are not really independent. They're linked by infrastructure, and he cites other issues of slowing down low-cost housing, particularly the cost of land. He argues that the community is the issue. And I'll just give you one quote from this two-part article. This is at the end of the first part. Is there perhaps a more radical approach to the problem of housing than the engineer and the mechanically minded architect have conceived? I think there is, for though Mr. Fuller, Buckminster, for example, believes he has swept aside all traditional tags in the dealing with the house and has faced its design with inexorable rigor, he has kept, with charming unconsciousness, the most traditional tag of all, namely the freestanding individual house. If we are thorough enough in our thinking to throw that prejudice aside too, we may, I suspect, still find a place for the architect in modern civilization. So that's he ends the house. So this article, 1930, January and February, appears before Frey has even arrived in the United States. But Coker, who was managing editor at Architectural Record, was certainly aware of it. And I think that Coker and Frey wanted, in some ways, to answer that and to say you can have both things. You can have mass production and you can have community. At the time of the exhibition in 1931, the show was reviewed by several architectural critics. Two were Douglas Haskell, who wrote this article, and another was Catherine Bauer. But as you see in this article, he's talking about more than just the Architectural League show. He's talking about another show, which is called Rejected Architects. When the show went up, Philip Johnson, who was not yet an architect, but was curator of MoMA, had been traveling around Europe researching modern architecture for Henry Russell Hitchcock to make a sequel to his 1929 modern architecture, Romanticism and Reintegration. He was enthusiastic about this research and very upset about the conservative selections in the League show, because the League show was a juried show, and they took very, very conservative examples. But the Aluminaire house happened to be sitting in the middle of that show, and it was not a very conservative example. So Johnson organized a counter show. It was called the Rejected Architects. It was a kind of salon de refusés, showing modern architecture, and he rented a space on 57th Street near 7th Avenue, not so far from here. So the League exhibition itself got very negative reviews from most architectural critics. Catherine Bauer wrote in the New Republic, and Douglas Haskell and Parnassus both point to the Aluminaire house as the only breath of fresh air. Bauer writes, one and only one exhibit, displays any curiosity whatsoever about the modern possibilities and a type solution for small dwellings. That is Mr. Coker's aluminum house. No one knew Albert Frey. Built full size from standard materials, completely and economically functional. It's a fine piece of work and well worth the 75 cents admission and even the general chaos. Haskell's longer review points out that Coker's house, again, was not a jury selection, and that is indicative, as industry is the motor of change. Both reviews also discuss Johnson's Rejected Architect show, but neither review gives that show as much attention or as much praise as Aluminaire. Haskell was a regular, oops, sorry, wrong way. No, I did it again. Okay, let's see. There we go. Haskell was a regular correspondent to the New Republic, same New Republic that exists today. And he, a few weeks later, wrote another article called The House of the Future. These were not illustrations from these articles. I just put them here as examples. So he publishes this article, House of the Future, a call to exploit mass production in order to update the building industries. Disgusted with the slow pace of progress in building methods, he cites the automobile industry as the model. A few weeks after his article, New Republic gives its pages over to Lewis Mumford to respond, and he responds with the flaw in the mechanical house. And Mumford repeats his warnings of mechanization of production versus community design. He writes in his article, this takes us closer to Ernst May in Frankfurt than it does to Mr. Ford and his ingenious but overrated Model T. I think Haskell and Mumford discussed the house of the future along with its proposed site plans, they might have found some common ground. At the close of the show, the house was taken down from Grand Central Palace, and it was bought. It was purchased by Wallace Harrison, architect of many things: Rockefeller Center, the UN, Lincoln Center, the Albany Mall. And Harrison had a piece of property on Long Island in Huntington, and he moved the house there and reassembled it. And in 1932, Philip Johnson spotted it, and it included it in the show at MoMA. The show was called Modern Architecture and International Exhibition, organized by Henry Russell Hitchcock and Philip Johnson, and the book that accompanied was the International Style. And these were the images included in that book. Here it's described, instead of the Aluminaire house, you can't probably read this, but the Harrison house, Long Island. So I don't know why. I could psychoanalyze Philip Johnson, but maybe he didn't really want the connection to the League show to read through in this very public presentation of the house. Michael will talk a little bit more about the Harrison reconstruction itself. But this is just an image from that MoMA show with the Villa Savoye there. But they didn't have a full-scale Aluminaire house in the show. They only had photographs of the Harrison house. So you want to talk about the reconstruction? So these are 1931, 32.
I'm back. These again are from the Coker archive, except the one on the right, which was Life magazine, of the reconstruction. So it was taken down. Harrison bought it for $1,000, and he put it up on his newly acquired property in Huntington. So these are two construction photographs. The one is the one view, besides that front view that Francis just showed, of the kind of iconic view of the Harrison house with that front and side view. This illustration is new construction happening right through the house, and Harrison decided this wasn't big enough for him. He had to make his own house. As part of this, which later he actually moved the Aluminaire house. And in 1932 issue of Life magazine, that's Wallace Harrison with some kind of strange contraption. It looks like he's walking a mechanical dog across the lawn, but in the background you can see the Aluminaire house and Harrison's editions of the house that still exists, and it's on the National Register today in Huntington. So in 1987, the second owner of the house after Harrison passed away wanted to demolish the house and develop the property with a number of units, and that would have counted as a unit. So he got a demolition permit, and everyone went ballistic, at least preservationists did. And also, what's his name? Goldberg. Paul Goldberg wrote a very important piece in the New York Times about the need to try to rescue this. This is that image. Again, this is from a later book by F.R.S. Yorkey, but the image that was in the MoMA show. And this is how we found the house in 1987. I took a position at New York Institute of Technology at this moment in 1987. I was asked if I was interested in being involved with the house. I said yes. I was chair at the Central Islip campus at the time, and we put in grant money. The president at that time said, yeah, we'll do it if you can get the money for it, which is what they always say, right? We got the money for it. We got the first modern grant from New York State Department of Preservation But in around 1940, Wallace Harrison decided he didn't want this house as part of his new creation, and he moved it down the hill. His property was rather hilly, and he embedded it into the hill so that the whole ground floor was lost and stuck onto a wood and cement block garage. So the view you see on the right, you can see it doesn't have the terrace up above or the entrance below. They filled in the terrace and the ground floor is missing. So in 1987, when we got the grant, and I should also say, very importantly, the grant was, we intentionally put in, we would do it all with students at the school. Not quite all, that was a little hard, but we started out right away. I had 10 semesters of students, 120 students, I tabulated recently, that worked on this project, one semester at a time, to take this apart and rebuild it on the Central Islip campus. A little bit messy inside. There had been one great party where everyone graffitied the thing at some point, and there were a lot of champagne bottles in the kitchen. You can see a lot had been changed. The stainless steel columns on there and so forth. And in the upper right, the bedroom was put over the double height of the living room, so the ceiling shouldn't be here. And that's the terrace on the lower right with, we actually made that hole to find the diagonal wall, if that was still there. 1984, 94, 94, we went out to visit Albert Frey for 3 days, and we set up a New York Tech camera, not knowing how to use it. We just set it there. And for 3 days, we interviewed Albert in his last house that is right behind where we put the Aluminaire house in the mountainous hills of Palm Springs. It's a desert, but it has mountains. So there's Albert telling us an awful lot of information. He's in his 90s at this time, and he knew everything about the house. He corrected all kinds of things we had supposed. And then with students, we took it apart. So this is taking the facade off, taking all the interior mess out, revealing in the lower left for the first time since the 40s what the double height space had looked like, because it was filled in and no one knew about that. The diagonal wall, the aluminum frame was all there except the columns had been cut in the garage at the lower level. And then we started to work in Central Islip. There's one of the first classes with the students. Actually, it's not. The first 3 classes were taking the house down and moving it to one of the buildings at the campus that was vacant, and siting it right in line with the School of Architecture and building it. One of my toughest semesters was convincing students that digging footings was educational. But in fact, there was enthusiasm always. In fact, you can see I had a hard time getting everyone to wear hard hats. It never happened. Fortunately, OSHA wasn't so strict then. And then you can see, as I described, the construction of the house, the girths, the vertical 2x2 angles, the wood nailers are all in place. The insulation, which we used Homasote, a fair approximation, tar paper, which was part of the original, and then the panels. We had Richard Myers Courthouse was being built, and we had the contractor donate the scaffold for a year. And on Saturdays, we had Carpenters Union help to do the panels. The students were less involved in that. And then in 1984, the campus was closed, and the house, we put a fence around the house.
2004.
2004. Sorry. So, it's all the same. Uh, any, anyway, so we put a fence around it. Yeah, keep telling me that. And, and it was basically abandoned. And after a year in this condition, some kids who walked home from school by it started throwing rocks at it. So we decided we had to do something. It had to be moved. And New York Tech gave us the house for $10. We established the Aluminaire House Foundation to seek a new home for it. Had hoped maybe to move it to Westbury, but that wasn't in the cards. And so in 2012, we took it all apart. These are views of the inside.
That's where we got on the inside.
Yeah. So this is where we sort of got to. On the left is an important moment we had a big celebration with Philip Johnson coming out to see the house. And it was in this state, in this beautiful fall image on the left, and an image we liked with the sun setting on it as we left the campus. Us trying to figure out where we're going. There was a New York Times article with the dean, Julio San Jose, a couple of students, a model they made, and me looking skeptical. So looking skeptical again. With Philip Johnson came out, we had a big dinner. We had a dozen or so architects of note come and talk briefly about why this house was important. And every year, with this, besides the student class, we had a lecture on housing. It started first with Ken Frampton, and then various people architects who are interested in housing. And we had a picnic. The students each year after the lecture organized a picnic and had fun. This was a sort of delicate moment because there's no diagonal bracing and everyone loved making it sway. So
Yeah.
Frances is going to talk about the next phase.
Right, Michael sort of,
She'll get the dates right.
maybe Michael sort of got there, but it was in 2012 where we didn't quite know where we were going to take that, but we knew we had to take it somewhere. So we actually hired a carpenter who we know, and his small crew came and they took it down in about a week. And we rented a trailer. And so we loaded the house into the trailer and then had it pulled to a storage yard in Ronkonkoma. But looking on Google Earth and asking around, we have a supporter here, Laura Heim. We found a site in Sunnyside Gardens, and we thought it was just right for contemporary with the design of the house. It was a corner lot. With Sunnyside Gardens to one side and Phipps houses to the other side. So we approached the owner of the lot, who was a developer who wanted to make 8 units on that lot, and she had the zoning for. But it was part of the landmark district. So we had to, and he had already been turned down on one proposal. And so we went to him and said, well, if we could design 8 units that would get approved, could we put the Aluminaire house on the corner? And he had very little interest in the Aluminaire house, but he did want to make 8 units. So he said, give it a try. And so we did. And we made a proposal for placing the house at that corner in Sunnyside. This was the existing site plan. It had been a playground that had been abandoned for many years, and according to latest reports, is still abandoned. And we made some renderings to promote the project, and we had a lot of conversations with the landmark staff, and they were quite supportive. But a lot of people in the immediate community did not want the house, and so our strong local support from architects was not enough to counteract the opposition, and they approached their politicians, and so Landmarks was not convinced to take the project. So as they pointed out to us, they never reject a project, they just don't approve. And so it was not approved. So actually, I'll just say so we finally went to the landmarks hearing where we were not approved. It was either December of 2013 or very beginning of 2014. We had been invited to give a talk about the house in Palm Springs, California, at Modernism Week, and the person who invited us, his name is Mark Davis. He was president of Modernism Week. Said, you know, it would be great to bring the Aluminaire house. I hear you're looking for a site. It's great to bring it to Palm Springs. And we said, well, we'd love to come and give a talk, but no thank you on the site because it's going to go to Sunnyside Gardens, because we were quite convinced it was going to work. So we went out there in 2014 and we talked about the house, and they said, what's happening? And we said, well, it doesn't look like it is going to Sunnyside Queens. And they said, well, why don't you bring it here? And they were very enthusiastic. And so for a number of years, we looked at sites, and we said in theory, yes, let's do it, but we got to find an appropriate site, which is the mission of the Aluminaire House Foundation, to find a site and to relocate the house. So in 2017, we actually didn't have the site that we finally will have, and Michael will talk about that. But the group in Palm Springs raised the money to bring the house across country, and ordered up this fancy wrapper for the trailer, same trailer that it had been in for 5 years in Ronkonkoma. And they sent it across the town. And the truck driver was nice enough to stop along the way and take photographs of St. Louis, for instance, and then arriving in Palm Springs near Frey's iconic gas station. And I think you want to talk about it? Yeah. Okay. I'll stay to correct.
We'll end this together. So in between 2017 and 2020, we tried, with the help of a committee that was formed to be part of the Aluminaire House Foundation, to find possible sites. And so on the bottom left, right-hand portion is the Museum of Art, Palm Springs Museum. And there was a park being designed in front of it. And so we had discussed the possibility of 2 sites. First, it was the one up above, and then the one below. There was a suggestion that it go next to a historic design center of the museum, a bank that is been converted into basically an architectural design center. But that didn't fly. And then finally, on the right, you can see 2 little gray points of the museum, with basically this site being developed as a sculpture garden with the new park that has been built actually since we started this in Palm Springs. Oops, on the wrong way.
One on the right.
And we were invited by the museum and one other development of an architectural school that hasn't happened, to ask for the house. And we made a presentation to the Palm Springs Art Museum with this site plan saying, if you took a portion of the parking lot and made a site precinct, basically, the house could go there. And we produced these 2 renderings to show its possible relationship to the museum on the lower right. And up in the hills behind it is Albert Frey's final house, called House 2, which is also owned by the museum. So this is the final site plan. We had to argue a lot that is a siteless building, basically. So it shouldn't look like it's too connected to the desert. Albert told us he would never build anything like this in the desert, and he in fact made the rest of his life in very site-sensitive buildings. And in 2000, we had to get over COVID.
Right.
Yeah, 2023, it was built in 4 or 5 months. That's for earthquakes on the lower left, which we didn't have to think about in Islip. And the slab is poured. You can see all the forms coming together. We did the whole thing in Central Islip with ladders, and these guys needed this heavy equipment to do it, which we kept reminding them of. But nevertheless, it was good that it all happened. And now we'll just show the final photographs of it being completed in March. As Marie pointed out, there was a ribbon cutting ceremony and event for the house. And we had it photographed so that we could finally publish our book and have pictures of it at the end of it. So these are views.
Just add for the students also that besides all that rebar in the slab, the 1/2-inch insulation board, which really wasn't very good insulation board, was replaced by plywood and then steel straps. So there was a lot of seismic action.
There's that view.
Yeah.
Actually, we didn't put it in this lecture, but there's 2 sketches of Albert, one where that
Yeah.
diagonal wall is straight, and then one where it's like this. And he said it was looking too finished on the corner.
Yeah, he wanted the top to sort of float. So there's the blank
There's the
facade.
blank facade, which we like. The aluminum panels are kind of like shingles in a sense. They overlap, and the aluminum screw and washer makes a pattern. So there's one of the diagrams that I didn't talk about was the pattern of the panels, which are not quite square, 48 by 44, and the screw pattern, which makes this tartan system. So the back facade, which you can't really see here, is very interesting.
We had to replace the panels when we rebuilt it in Islip, and we had the alloy analyzed, and they very quickly become less shiny. They kind of whiten out. It's not anodized aluminum, so we're looking forward to that in Palm Springs. They're very, very shiny right now. So this is the second refabrication of the panels, same gauge and the same alloy.
So up into here, this is everything we knew about the house and had actually rebuilt in Islip. The whole inside, as you saw from those photographs, was incomplete. So one of the wonderful things for us was when we got to this point, we got to see what it was like inside. And so this is the entrance foyer and the stair going up. We don't have a boiler yet. There's no furniture. The rollout table isn't there yet, but here you can see coming to the top of the stairs to the dining room, and from the dining room looking towards the double height living room with that bathroom.
The finished floor is all gray linoleum. That was what the original was. It's a kind of a decking. It's a steel interlocking deck. That's the floor structure, and then a kind of subfloor and this linoleum. And though we haven't been able to do the fabric cord yet, we're hoping for yet one more phase of this. They agreed to paint the plywood to replicate the colors that Robert Ray had proposed. So we have a sense of what those.
And
that
we selected the colors from the sketches. And also there's a company in Switzerland that's making 1931 Le Corbusier paint. So,
we just got Benjamin Moore.
but we matched. So there's the stair going up to the library. You can see the exposed aluminum frame and columns. All the columns show intentionally. They're even kind of built around so they show extra. Beginning to see that. I think the next one is one of our favorite shots of the bathroom.
So that's on the interior wall. That's, the inner half of the space girder here, and then the beam that ties into it.
Hardly anybody ever wrote about the house after 1934, except one paragraph or maybe two by Rainer Banham in his Well-Tempered Environment book, something like that, where he said, who would put a bathroom over the top of a dining room? But it was an exhibition. This is the bathroom, the toilet cabinet, which
That's the only interior finishing that we have
Yeah.
that gets these translucent panels. It's beautiful aluminum.
this is the bedroom, the dumbwaiter going up through the closets. The mezzanine, with the bathroom, looking out over the living room. And the terrace, no lawn. But the dumbwaiter, which is now full of air conditioning equipment, has the doors. So this is the sort of four lives of, actually there's more than four, but Albert's first sketch, the Harrison house on the right, Central Islip, and then finally Palm Springs.
In this photo, they opened two windows, as Albert always showed. Two windows opened up in his sketch. Thank you. I think.
We have mics.
Yeah.
That's Gandhi.
I'm gonna be in the middle. I guess so. All right. You wanna be, sure, otherwise.
No, I get this stuff done.
Okay. Is this on?
Thank you, Michael and Francis. This was an extraordinary lecture and an extraordinary story, and something that I've been hearing about since I first met you both many, many years ago. And I think, first of all, just congratulations on an incredible feat of saving this wonderful architectural treasure. Congratulations, just and a tribute to all the work that you guys have both put into this effort, and then congratulations on this wonderful book. So you didn't talk too much about the book, but I want to give you a plug here. I spent some time reading this, and it actually is. It has a lot of comic relief. It has, and it has an incredible level of detail and kind of analysis as well about both the history and the significance of the house, as well as the story that you both then continue with in your journey with the house. So congratulations. I guess it's my job to moderate. And so I have a few kind of thoughts that come to mind as I read through the book and as I listen to you both talk. You mentioned the Lewis Mumford article, Mass Production and the Modern House, and how this project was in some ways a response to some of the criticism of the time when speaking about mass production and sort of, an assembly of parts, and this idea that perhaps the art of production was lost through this kind of more factory esque idea of mass production, right? And then the question of community, as you both kind of alluded to, and whether a house like this could be something that created community. And I think both those topics, right? You kind of covered how the house did that and responded to that. I think both of those topics, whether it's a question of standardization, sort of kit of parts, this idea of prefab today, this idea of design for affordability, I think these are topics that are pertinent today. And on the community side, of course, we always talk about community when we're talking about housing, and how housing is really a project that is not just about the object of architecture, but also about urbanism. And so I wanted to kind of bring forth that question to you about, in all of your pouring of your heart and soul into this project, what are the lessons that we can extract from the architecture of this treasure that we can then apply to the questions of today as it comes to this question of assembly and disassembly. We even talk about design for disassembly when it comes to circular economies and, carbon reduction and so on. So for the students today, how can we bring some of these lessons to bear in how we, kind of think about these questions today? Was that too hard?
No, maybe not. I think one of the things that we've been so passionate about in the story of the house is making sure that it doesn't remain as the weekend house, as
Right.
this little getaway that it was billed as in 1932. Another interesting thing in talking about the house with various people is the issue of prefabrication versus standardization of parts. And I think a lot of people say, oh, it's the first prefabricated house. It's not prefabricated in the same way of, set in place panels that
Right.
are delivered to the site. In fact, that all this stuff was delivered to the site. If Albert Frey very carefully figured out what he needed and what those parts were. And when we lost the 5-inch columns down below, we just ordered heavy duty 5-inch aluminum pipe and we got it, cut it to size. That was it. It had the same sleeve detail that they had up above. But the issue of community is an important one. It hasn't really changed. I mean, this was a kind of low rise community that was
Mhm.
described here, but it was certainly to make attached houses.
Yeah, I would say, as Francis has said, that it's not a prefab. Although the term was about during a lot of these
Yeah.
discussions.
Mm.
But that's because of the commission. Basically, it was supposed to show materials and pick from actually what was available to them to work with. So the kind of off the shelf part of it is more the point than prefabrication. But I think in those terms, the house is more of a symbol than a literal pursuit. It's about a kind of demonstration of a will towards trying to think about these issues and make a real demonstration of the possibility. I mean, the house, Albert, the house that Francis showed in the record article has 3 or 4 bedrooms. It's much more rational and less exciting spatially. And Albert said, well, it was an exhibition. I had to make it exciting to be there. So it has a lot of different kind of subtleties, I think, but the one of it being an important symbol of a desire to solve this problem, which we still have today. I mean, this last year, the discussion about the need for housing, all of you students are in the right lane to be involved in the fact that we don't have enough housing and we don't know how to have enough housing. So one part of it is obviously political, but another part is solving the problem in a way that it can actually come about and be built.
But another interesting thing, maybe a lesson for students, is that they were given the job of displaying building products.
Yeah.
And they made a house prototype and a community prototype. So they used that job for their own agenda. And maybe that's what you kind of
That's
have to
interesting. Yeah.
push for.
Yeah, no, I was actually going to ask you if you knew in 1931 terms the actual cost of putting that exhibition together, because the other question. So, the chapter that on all of the ideas of the unit and the repeatability of the unit and how it creates that urbanistic notion is something that I found super interesting in the book, and you never see that because you always see the project in the round. You always see it as a singular object. And so it's almost, I lament the fact that there couldn't have been a second house, right? That actually attaches to that blank facade so that we understand that that's actually the intention, right? Rather than just understanding it from an article that happened a year later, right? I was going to ask you if that came from, you alluded to how this fits and was inspired by a lot of the experimental housing exhibitions in Europe, right? With Weisenhof Siedlung in Stuttgart, and this idea of, how we create housing for the masses. And so I wonder, and then we get into socialism versus capitalism and this idea of wanting the single family individualized, house with a picket fence and a yard in the American dream. And I'm wondering, you know, would it have helped the case for this house to have had that second module? Right. Does that contribute to the lost history of this project, this notion in America to really emphasize the individual versus the unit?
Well, I think that goes back to the same issue. How far can you push a second agenda?
Yeah,
You know,
sure,
not
of course.
only asked to display materials, certain things came, when we visited Albert, we said, why is that back facade black? And, is it because of, Le Sueur and, that possibility? He said, yeah, but we weren't asked to do any of that. To propose to make a house was elaborate. To propose to make a house that had kind of European imagery, but American technology, which is, I think, what we think is really interesting about the house, that it has these two things coming together, was not asked for. Although pushed a little bit because they were showing modern materials, stuff that was just becoming available. And the Alcoa, the panels were made by Alcoa, so they grabbed them. And Albert, you could see the oil canning in the photographs, and in the desert sun, those panels move a lot. And they put the screws too tight, which we tried to tell them not to, but that all that kind of technology is,
Right.
yeah.
And the house itself is also, it's just like a beautiful sequence of spaces. I mean, you can make a prefabricated house that sort of does the job, but this one sort of does it really, really elegantly.
And so just as a side question, perhaps even the house and the cost of that exhibition was sponsored by perhaps the vendors and the
Oh, yeah,
manufacturers.
the material was all donated.
Material.
The
Yeah.
material was all
Right.
donated.
They said, Albert and Coker said that it would cost $3,200 if it were made in multiples. And one of the things that in the articles that Francis brought about is there's a problem with mass production, that the first run is incredibly expensive because it's not mass produced yet. So all the kind of learning process and making the first batch is incredibly expensive. So it's very hard to get the machine rolling towards mass production.
To that effect, right, when we think about prefab today, often these prefab sort of companies own all of the sort of proprietary rights of all of the materials and the connections and the pieces that might go into that unit. And here you have a collection of vendors that are coming together.
Yeah.
And, it's kind of a test of how those things might come together. But I assume, it's a question of agreements and a question of, you're right, it's not really mass production.
It's hard to imagine how they all got along, putting that thing together in 7 days. And it's so tight that they must have been, everyone was in everybody else's way.
Right. We asked Albert Frey if he was nervous about that. He said, no, but I would be now. He was 28 years old. It's amazing.
I had a question because you mentioned, that at the very end that the project was really sightless, right? But in effect, it had at least 5 sites from my count, right? So the Grand Central Palace in its exhibition, as the Weekend House in Huntington, then it moved down the hill in Huntington, and then Central Islip, and the proposed site in Sunnyside, and then of course now in Palm Springs. And I'm wondering, because you've had the privilege of seeing the house in at least 2 or 3 of those sites, how you see the siting of that house changing its perception or changing its understanding in terms of, because is it really just an interiorized condition? It's not, right? It has some relationship to the inside and outside. In theory, we all want it to have relationship to orientation and the sun with daylight and shadows. He has a very particular sketch with shadows, and that's something that requires a sighting. And so I'm wondering what of the project changes in its perception when it goes from site to site, in your opinion, and how you've experienced this.
In our playing around with different sites, which was a little frustrating because we thought they'd find one and we'd just do it. But a couple of them, the big window faced north, and we said, it all works fine this way. In the end, the big window faces south. And we've planted giant palm trees to try to create shade for it. Because of the code, we've got an AC unit going up through the dumbwaiter shaft. But it's slightly preposterous where it is. I mean, it doesn't belong in the desert. And Albert told us right away. I'm not sure if we asked him, would he ever think about building it here, but it's very clear. His architecture, if I could distort it a little bit, kind of changed from Le Corbusier to Mies, and probably influenced by Schindler and Neutra to some extent, that the kind of overhanging roofs, the consciousness of shadows and so forth, is where his work moved right away as soon as he went back out and staked his claim to Palm Springs. So it's a little bit of a mirage, I would say.
One thing that's really great about the site in Palm Springs, and I agree with Michael's analysis of the rest of it, and we had to fight the initial landscape architect who was hired, who had it rotated at an angle, and he had cacti and everything all around. And we said, no, you can't do any of that.
Gravel.
But what's great about it is it's very public, and not only is it open, the site you can walk even in around the house whenever the museum is open without even getting a ticket, but it's always out there. It's right on the intersection of 2 really important streets in Palm Springs, so it's present in the city night and day.
Yeah.
So that part we're very happy about. So, and Albert's house too is up the hill. And we call him Albert because there's a lot of controversy about Frey and Fry. I mean, he was Fry in Switzerland, but when he came to the States, people saw F-R-E-Y and they said Frey, and he said, okay, I'm Frey. But
And when you're thinking about site, of course, there's the, sort of climate issues, and you're now talking about insulation versus, air conditioning and things like that. There's also material properties, right? And so, you mentioned that the panels had to be replaced twice in all of the assembly. And so, there's also a question of the longevity of something like this, right? And as an exhibition, maybe it was just built as a lifespan of 7 days versus a larger kind of, question of this could become a model for housing somewhere, and what would have to be done with its materiality, with the treatment of those materials. How would you consider bringing that to a level of a longer lifespan?
Well, it's made it to age 92.
But and actually, and the replacement of the panels is because the system is so simple. The screw goes through, it goes into the nailer. Once you take it out, and if the panel gets bent, it's in trouble. So unless, if you're not disassembling and reassembling, I think, so in that way,
Yeah.
I don't think it fits the bill for something that would be easily disassembled and reassembled. It would have to be a better marking system of how that goes through. I mean, there's a very clear system of the screw pattern, but this is one trouble we had when reassembling it in Islip. You know, once the carpenters made a mistake, that was it. We ruined the whole panel. We had to get another panel. So there was a lot of hand holding and in putting the project together. But the main damage was the disassembly and the denting in the process of disassembly.
Yeah, and Harrison had abused it so much in
Right.
infilling. He moved, the panels on the kind of signature side elevation were not the original panels. It was a different kind of aluminum pan. And he obviously had to steal those to make the bedroom, replace the terrace and so forth. So it was, the first thing we saw was the panels were really destroyed. And that was complicated because we don't have a school of preservation, but issues of preservation, reconstruction versus preserving, there's a whole bunch of definitions, and a lot of it depends on the original fabric. And we had to write a historic structures report, and we had consultants from preservationists to write that report with us. And the issues of the panels came up, and the issue of what percentage of the original is going to be rebuilt. Because if it goes over a certain amount, it becomes a reconstruction rather than a rebuilding of order. And we presented a kind of carefully made argument to New York State that the idea of the house was shiny and new future, not Washington slept here kind of preservation issues. So that the notion about trying to, again, capture the idea rather than the literal thing was an important issue. And fortunately, New York State gave us the approval to replace the panels.
I want to actually pause and consider just how many hats you've had to wear in this process. So you mentioned historic preservationist, right? You know, when we do research as, you know, professors and researchers and architects, and we work with students, we often don't communicate to the students just how much we're learning from the process as well, right? Well, by engaging all of the obstacles and the challenges of going through this journey, this 37-year journey, right? You've acted as, you know, obviously architect, but you've also acted as almost an archaeologist or, you know, a sort of researcher of figuring out how and what was intended. You know, you acted as an advocate. You've created a nonprofit. You are now nonprofit directors, right? You had to fundraise. You had to kind of. So I'm wondering if you can comment on. We don't learn about all of those different, you know, kind of hats when we're in school,
Yeah.
right? And when we do a project like this, when you're committed, you start to introduce all of that into your own language. And I wonder how much came easy to you, how you felt about, you know, taking on all of these roles.
We didn't know what we were getting into.
That's right. I figured as much.
Yeah, it came by just trying to overcome obstacles. We thought we had a clear path. We were gonna take it apart. That happened easily. We stored it, we cleaned it up, we started rebuilding it. We thought it was a piece of cake. But we did have to get a building permit, and we had the ADA. In fact, people can't go into the house today because it doesn't permit handicap access. We have a solution to that famous back wall. Actually, during the exhibition, if you imagine 130,000 people going through it, Albert designed a back door and a stairway for people to go up through and leave without coming back through. So we figure that's a good there's precedent for connecting it in the back way. But yeah, I mean, there were obstacles, and we had to petition New York State to be able to build it as a house and then convert it into a public place. And we learned a lot. You're right,
I
exactly.
said, how can you call it a historic house? It's just a pile of aluminum right now. He said, and I think the inspector from the Islip Building Department came around the first week and said, "Where's the certificate for the steel?" And we said, we don't have one. And he said, "Okay." And he never came back.
I'd like to open it up also to the audience here and Zoom, if there are any questions. Any students? Students? Not lifetime students.
No student, come on. I mean, it's inspiring to see and to hear, in the same conversation talking about social issues and materials and light at the sunset towards the aluminum and the screw too tight. So the quantity of scale that the conversation cross when we talk of architecture is inspiring, and it's great. And it's also a little bit scary because we have to know a lot about things that we learn while we go. And it's an interesting part of the job. And it's about being creative also in solving problems that are bureaucratic problems, logistic problems. Creativity is also applied there. But knowing the project that you have been building after or during that, how much what you learn or the lesson that you learn, beside the tenacity, the patience, and all of that, in doing your own project, in build your own building, because you build several houses, some of which you live into also, that I can see similarities clearly with that, with this. How much from this came from that, and in some way, how much of that helped in your job as educators from what you learn? Or it's a methodology that you learn, it's a content.
Well, we obviously sort of been talking about all the different obstacles which became learning opportunities, which is wonderful. And we had an interesting one when we were going to take it apart. We had to figure out how we're going to know how to put it back together again. And we had a historian in Central Islip and Westbury, Gary Hess, who did archaeology in the summers with our New York Tech students in France. And he went through the whole archaeological process of establishing a grid. And so we took it apart. Each layer we stopped and made drawings of it, photographed it in black and white and color and stuff. And that we had to, just from the problem of how are we going to know how to put this together? There's one story in, there's a really good book on Albert Frey by Joseph Rosa that I would recommend to you also about all of Frey's work. But when Harrison bought the house for $1,000 and moved it to Huntington, they had numbered all the panels with something like a magic marker. And it rained and all the numbers were and so he thought he was going to put it together. In fact, I think Albert told him, well, you can do it in a month's time. It took him 3 or 4 months to put it together. And maybe one reason the panels are so messed up was from the rainstorm that did it. But yeah, no, I think there's always, I mean, I in particular, and Francis, and I think many of you practice as well as teach, and the kind of reciprocity between those two things of what did you learn from your practice to pass on to the students, and what are the things that are happening in the school, and the kind of research and the things you see other people doing in school all have an influence on yourself. So I don't know if that answers the question, but I think it's very valuable to have your foot in a lot of places at the same time. And I would say, I think we started the first project of New York Tech of building students being involved in actual building. That went on to Professor Michelle Bertoman in Central Islip and then in Westbury doing two of the solar decathlon houses, which there's another one with experience of. So, and then Professor Gandhi took over the reins and has pursued a lot of hands-on student projects, and those are always wonderful. The couple of things that are sort of extracurricular but very curricular, like summer programs and these sort of design build or community involvement, are all fantastic expansions of one's education, which all gives us as teachers a benefit too.
One last question.
Any questions on Zoom?
It's not necessarily a question, but since I was part of the Sunnyside adventure, I think it might be interesting for the students to elaborate on how something that's the same scale and of the same time period and really should have resonated slightly for all those reasons was so opposed. I mean, was it the material? Was it the shininess? Was it was an object? Was it that it paired like everything else? I mean, I just think it was fascinating to see that all unfold when it was a prototype. It was like a Sunnyside house that could have been repeated, and you were putting it on display. So I just thought maybe you should talk a little bit about why it got that reaction.
We were going to ask you that question, Laura.
We should say this is Laura Heim, who taught in Central Islip and in Manhattan for 8 years, right? And
Has a practice in Sunnyside.
and lives in one of the Sunnyside houses, as Mumford did. So she lived through that phase of our project too, trying to help us navigate.
I
But
remember Ken Frampton's face when he came out of that hearing. I was like,
We were all devastated. People had posters with a picture of the Aluminaire house with the big knot through it. And I think, and Kenneth Frampton got up and spoke on our behalf. He's the third member of the foundation, which will be dissolved before long because I think we've fulfilled our mission. But he at the elevator said, the people have spoken.
but you're right. I mean, we felt, and in fact, our early work with landmarks felt that this was a very appropriate project, and it in terms of scale, it's interesting because Sunnyside Gardens is very low scale, kind of single family but combined houses. But Phipps, by the same architects, is quite large on the other side. So we had two very different scales, but we tried to, I know, Laura, you warned us, I remember this vividly. We proposed our 8 units to be this kind of modern, but relating to the tradition of the brick Sunnyside Gardens. So we proposed terracotta panels. And Laura said, they're not gonna like that. And that came up strongly in the proposal. Besides the Aluminaire house, there was criticism of our 8 units. But I mean, there were a lot of fears. One was that it was a public building in a residential neighborhood, although, you know, hardly anybody's going to go to it except architects. And there was also a lot of questions about how the foundation was going to keep this thing going alive as an institution, which we didn't have great answers for. It's another one of those building blocks that we were going to have to learn. But yeah, no, we thought it was the right place and the right set of implications and stuff for it. And we proposed that the garage even have the kind of history of Sunnyside Gardens on display with it. So that that all seemed to make sense. But something when we went to the community board before landmarks, we were having trouble, and I can't remember his name, the council member, yeah, who said it was a spaceship that was landing in our neighborhood.
How about that?
We saw the writing on the wall, well, along with those.
It's also, you were talking about wearing many hats. I mean, this is, you don't know you're going to get into this. You're an architect, you have a great idea. It's amazing. You're trying to talk to the community. The community has all this misinformation or information, you know, it's a very complicated thing with the community to convince them. I actually think they just wanted it to be a park.
Yeah, yeah, there was that side of it too.
Finally bought the park. They have done nothing with it. But I
They
think
already
that
have a
was-
park.
We need housing.
Yeah.
Well, it might be more received better now.
Oh, we can make another one.
We've got the recipe.
We know how.
I have one question, you know, you said, well, no one's gonna go there except the architects, right? When the project was in Central Islip, did the faculty use it as a didactic tool? In other words, you know, I can see, you know, this being a place where you learn about building construction, about housing, about, you know, materials, about interiors, about a lot of different things. And so was it used on a regular basis as part of our architectural labs and spaces and you know, you could even draw in it and, you know, do some viz classes, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, the classes that I had students directly involved, but we cited it right in front of everyone's in front of the studios. So it was always kind of looming in as a kind of important aspect of the school. Whether people used it as in their classwork, probably some. I think
I think so.
it always
The
had
building construction.
some influence on.
We would get occasional visitors.
We-
A group of students came from Potsdam.
Yeah.
They were looking at modern architecture on Long Island, you know, and so they.
Yeah, we had
they
preservation
took
Long
photographs
Island.
of that. And, yeah. And so they're, you know, and then occasionally architects would just call us up and say, we heard this thing is on your campus. Can we come see it? We said, of course.
Yeah. No, I just wonder because there, you know, there are a number of architectural gems that are often
Yeah.
in danger of being
Right.
demolished. And I wonder if this becomes a model
Yeah.
of, you know, a university kind of adopting something like that because you can make a case that it's actually a place for learning. Right. So I just kind of.
Yeah, that's interesting because when we presented it to the museum, when the museum said they wanted it and what was it? We were also had an offer from a college of the desert, which sounds terrible, but the College of the Desert was developing an architecture school in Palm Springs as part of the University of California, Pomona School of Architecture. And they wanted it to be right where they were going to build this new school. But economically, that whole thing fell through and we thought it would be more visible at the museum.
Yeah.
More accessible to the public.
The campus that they were proposing didn't happen. And that offer was in the very first months of 2020. The whole thing ended.
I have a quick question. How come, you mentioned in passing about terracotta panels. How come it's never really explored, I guess? Because I understand that the aluminum panels were the original idea, right? But those could instead be subbed out for other materials, the same, you know,
Well,
same.
the terracotta was on the units that we designed to surround the back of the house, not the Aluminaire house itself. But when we visited Albert, we told him that the panels were really thin. And he said, yeah, I wanted something big, but Alcoa wasn't making it. And Coker said, we're going with what Alcoa has. So he said, why don't you put heavier duty ones? Albert was not a real preservationist. He was very, very open to making things better.
But we did
But-
want to replicate the original product, so we
Yeah.
didn't want to. We didn't, Albert was ready to mess around with his design, but we were not.
We thought that terracotta was an interesting dialogue between the aluminum panels and traditional bearing wall brick buildings.
Any other questions? Well, thank you both.
Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Thank you. And we're, if anyone wants to buy a book,
It's a
we
great
can
book.
sign it. And we'll be here for a few moments.